Hello. Today I'm going to be showing you how to add a new instrument to main GUI. The first thing you want to do whenever you want to add a new instrument to main GUI is just create the basic library to do all the low-level commands that you want to do with whatever instrument you're working with. In this case today we're going to be adding in the oriel spectrometer as a white light filter at the input of our imaging system. So you can see here I've already got all the basic functions for the oriel spectrometer already written, and I can go ahead and test them if I want. And I've got the oriel on COM port 20. That's what the 20 is there. And I can query the current wavelength, and all the other ones work too. So once you've got that, once you've got your basic library, then we want to start adding this into main GUI and creating some buttons to control it, make sure we're saving data, things like that. I've got a bit of an outline for myself here, so I'm going to try to make it so you don't have to sit and watch me type code too much. I've already got the code written out over here in a separate file. So hopefully we can make this go pretty quickly. So what we want in main GUI, we want to add two new buttons. There will be a button right here that says white light filter and a button next to it that says wavelength, and we can basically control it just like a spectrometer, because it is a spectrometer, where we can set the wavelength, press the button, and then it'll change the spectrometer settings so that only that wavelength of light gets through. Now, in order to do this, we're actually going to do a little trick. So the oriel is actually already integrated into MATLAB. So for example, if I open up Device Initializer and I turn on the oriel, I can see that everything there worked fine, and it can function just like a spectrometer. But this is actually more so for the Thor Labs camera imaging, which is on the other output port, the C port on the oriel spectrometer. What we want to do is create a new device that we're going to call white light filter. That way main GUI doesn't get confused and think that you're using two spectrometers at the same time. So we're also going to create a copy of all these buttons that the oriel spectrometer uses down here. Alright, just looking at my outline for how we do this. Let me just mark off that I've done the intro here. Okay, so the first part, when you want to add a new device to main GUI, is to add it to the device's structure. So I'll go ahead and edit main GUI. And I'm going to scroll up here to the opening function, and you can see all the different devices have various properties stored. So the spectrometer has a state, a name, a grading, a gratings. Grading is a numerical value, gratings is a cell of strings, and the mirror saying which exit is being utilized. And what we're going to do is we're going to add in another field to this device's structure, which will correspond to our white light filter. So now I've already typed all that out, so let me just copy and paste that over here. Now, it doesn't matter where I put it, but since the oriel white light filter is really just an oriel spectrometer, I'm going to put it pretty close by, just right underneath. And now you can see I'm calling this device the white light filter, and then there's the state variable that says if it's on or off. This will become on once we initialize communications. There's the name, there's the grading number, the gradings list, and the mirror, which is the exit port that's being utilized. Now in this case, yeah, our get gradings and our get grading are not particularly exciting because the oriel only has one grading. So this is all just recorded inside our code. Unlike the Spectra Pro, which actually can change gradings and things like that. Okay, so now I've put that into place. And what we want to do is add in some buttons to the device initialization GUI. So I go ahead and type guide device initialization GUI. And what did I spell wrong? There it is. Oops, sorry, can't spell right now. There we go. Okay, and then that pops this up onto my screen. And let's see, how many buttons are we going to have to make here? Pretty much we're going to copy everything that's already exists for the Oriel, but we're just going to rename them, essentially. So it looks like I've got 5 things I need to work with. So now let's see if I can get fancy. Well, I'll tell you what, I should show you how to make buttons anyway, so I won't just copy and paste everything all at once. So I'll copy, Control C, click down here, Control V, and then we're going to go into the Property Inspector. Now I've got it all listed out here what I need to name each of these, so bear with me while I look up what I've written down. This one is the button that's going to initialize communications with the Oriel white light filter. And I've written that we need to call that the Oriel white light filter initialize. And the string, instead of Oriel spectrometer, it should say white light filter. Something like that. Make sure it fits, looks good. And okay, once the tag is done, that's fine. Next up, we'll make a copy of this COM tag here. That way people know that the input to the right is a COM port. Doesn't really matter, but we'll go ahead and change the tag of this to Oriel white light filter COM text. Next up, we'll make a copy of this box. And these tags are very important because this is how I'm going to reference these buttons and assign callback functions to them. This one I've got that I should call it Oriel white light filter COM input. And the default number, I just chose one, is 20. Since that's the COM port that my Oriel spectrometer is currently on my computer. Okay, that looks good. And now we go ahead and copy this mirror. And again, this tag really doesn't matter, but we'll keep our naming convention. And lastly, the drop down to select which exit mirror is being utilized. Which I seem to have called, is it option or options? Hold on, can't read my notes. It's options. Okay. Now in this case, the strings are already set. We know that the C port is the Thorlabs camera and the B port is the side. And I guess maybe I could put in something like white light filtering, since this is going to be used as the input to another spectrometer. Okay, all of that looks pretty good. Let me check my notes. Now we're ready to start editing the callback functions of these buttons. So what I'm going to do is just click anywhere on this GUI. I'm going to hit Control S to save it. And then I'm going to go ahead and close Guide, since I don't need it anymore for this. And now what that did for me is it automatically made these functions at the bottom. Now, this is a personal preference for convention. I don't like these extra comments that they add to be outside the code. I like to put sort of more broad comments outside of the code, sort of talking about the structure of it, less less generic. These comments, I mean, executes during object creation. That's not really insightful, so I just throw that inside at the top so I don't have to look at it. I also prefer to put an end statement on each individual function. I just find that that feels a lot more organized to me. And then when we're all done writing all this, I will move these to a more appropriate location in the code. Because right now what it did is it just threw it down here underneath my spacer comment. But if you look at how I actually organize this code, I sort of group things up and I, add some comments and things to help out. But for now, we'll just leave them down here. Okay. Now, all right, we got through that. Looks good. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to code it so that some of these buttons actually do something. So right now all of them are pretty much just blank functions with no real code being executed inside of them. I guess there's something here. Well, this is a creation function, so we don't care about it anyways, really. Really what we're going to be interested in is these callback functions. So let's see. These two are for selecting the exit mirror. And then these two are really for these three are for initializing communications. There. Okay, so this button or this text input, we don't really need that to execute any code, so that's already done. And the creation functions we don't care about. This function though, this is what executes when we click that button. I'll show you which one. Now it might freak out a little bit. Okay, when I click this button, that's the one I'm about to edit now. Yeah, and it freaks out because all sorts of stuff going on that we haven't fixed yet. Okay, the first part here, any COM port device, what you've got to do is get the input that the user gave for the COM. I've already written this, so I'm just going to copy and paste it. So this reads out that number 20 that we have written in that one box. Now, of course, if that number changes, if it's on another COM port, the user can change that number, or they can go into Device Manager and change that, but this is how we put it in here. And then what we want to do is try to open up communications. And the way I like to do this is with a try-catch statement. Probably not great coding, but that's what I do. So, initialize communications with Oriel, then update our devices structure. By the way, that devices structure that we make in main GUI, that will be passed to our device initialization GUI when we call it. And it'll then be passed back to main GUI after we make our changes. So all of this should, get back to main GUI eventually. So go ahead and try to open communications with it. I guess we don't really need this spectrometer thing written here. That's just a handle to the device. And then we can update our devices so the state becomes on. The white light filter is the oriel. Currently we only have one filter in our lab, but in case we ever had more, you can, follow this same structure. The grading and gradings is kind of silly, but we threw it in there. And then the exit mirror tells us whether it's going to the Thor Labs camera or the input to our system here. And then it looks like once you initialize the device, you gray out the box because it's already been initialized, and you turn on the mirror selection box. And then this is just reading the current mirror that is being used inside the oriel white light filter, and it's setting the GUI to match whatever the current setting is. So I'll show you that in a few minutes. And then if that doesn't all work, then we get a catch and a warning: communication with the oriel filter failed. And then after that, just two generic lines of code basically. This one, whenever you make a GUI in MATLAB, you're constantly doing this GUI data update thing, because it's sort of like a global variable that you have to be able to update externally. And then after that, set this back to ready to let the user know we're done working. Oh, and I never put a working statement on top, did I? No, I didn't. Okay, let's just go copy one from maybe the spectrometer initialization button. Let's find it in here. And all that does is it changes that text at the very top of the device initialization GUI to read working, so the user knows that it's responded. It's just that sometimes these devices can take up to 30 seconds to initialize, and you want to let the user know that it's not stalling on something. We could do string to double, I guess. Can I just fix that auto? I'm not going to bother to fix it then. Okay, so next, all right, let's program in the mirror selection button. Let me pull up my notes for this. All right, the callback function for the mirror. And you know what? I kind of always prefer for my callback function to be the lowest one, because it's sort of like easier to read it to me. So I'm just going to move my callback buttons to be on the bottom. Doesn't really matter. I guess there is something to say about the order in which the code would execute. Callback would always be last compared to an input or a creation function. Okay. So now what we got to do is first let the user know it's working, because the mirror can take up to 30 seconds to switch. And now what we're going to do is read off which value the user selected. So did they select 1 or 2 basically? And this is sort of hard coded in here, but I know that mirror 1 is front and mirror 2 is side, and those are going to be an input string to my oriel function. And let's just go ahead and copy the rest of this all at once here. Send the command to the oriel spectrometer, so I'm sending it either front or side to tell it which exit port I want it to use. And then compare and see, all right, did we get what we requested? If so, just record it in the devices structure as white light filter.mirror. If we didn't get what we requested, still record what we got, but just warn the user something went wrong. And then again, GUI update data and let the user see we are ready to go. Okay. All right, let me check my notes here. All right, code disable enable on open function. Okay, so next up, let's just go in and test this as it is right now. All right, it's on COM20. All right, check MATLAB for any warnings. Nothing showed up. All right, and so right now it seems to say that it's outputting to the Thorlabs camera. I want it to output to the white light filter. So I'm going to select that. It's working. It's rotating the exit mirror now. This takes a little bit. Okay, and it's done. So now if I close this, I might get all sorts of errors because I haven't taken care of main GUI yet. Seems like it's okay. Now, if I go back into initialize devices, these buttons are back to what they were before. So it says C, but we're pretty sure we're on B. And this button should be grayed out. So what we want to do now is code in that it'll automatically disable these buttons if it's already been initialized. And one other thing I'm noticing there is that the mirror selection was already available before I turned on the device. See how this is here? If I call this without initializing, I'll get all sorts of errors. So we need to gray this button out similar to these buttons up here. I'm sure there's a few ways we can do that. I'm just going to check and see if, oh, well, it'll take care of itself in my opening function. So I'll do it this way. All right. So I've already got this code written out here, so let me just copy it, and I'm going to find the spectrometer and just put it right underneath that. Okay, so in the opening function for the device initialization GUI, if the white light filter is on, go ahead and turn the initialization button off. Also turn off the Oriel spectrometer initialize button, since they are the same device actually. And the oriel filter mirror choosing drop down, turn that on. Alright, good. And get the current mirror settings and update it to whatever is going on in there. Okay, this looks good. And if it's not already turned on, disable the mirror selection and turn on the initialization abilities. Okay, so let's try it out. Okay, this is on, this is off. Now this is on. I would like this to also gray out. And I think this is still wrong here, something's off here. So let's go fix that up. Okay, so I just did an edit here because I spent a few minutes trying to find a bug. It was just a little typo problem involving what I had written in some of these here. But now it should be good to go. So now let's go test it out. All right, it set it to B port, second one, which is what it's set to in real life. It's actually light is actually exiting the spectrometer through that port. And now if I initialize devices again, oh, it's set to C port when I turn it on. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we go back to our opening function. And right here, where I wrote devices.spectrometer, I should have written devices.whitelightfilter. There. Let's go ahead and try it again. So I turn it on. That's grayed out. Good. This is available. Initialize it. Sets it to B port. Good, because that's what it's actually set to right now. And now if I do it one more time, B port. Good. So now it's displaying accurate information every step of the way. All right, let me check my notes. All right, I think the next thing to do is to work with main GUI. Let me just double check. If string comp, yes, okay, we're all caught up now. So now what we want to do is start editing the main GUI code. So we can go back to main GUI, and we're going to want to add some buttons. So we go ahead and open up main GUI with guide. Alright, so now what I'm envisioning is two buttons just like this to the right of it. And in order to work with the code I've already written ahead of time, we got to make sure we put correct tags on them. Alright, so the tag for this one, I have that it should be white light filter button. And the string should probably be something like white light filter. Does that actually fit? It's a little crowded, but it just barely fits. And then this one should have a tag of white light filter input. And by default, we have it set to 0, which would be a full pass-through of all wavelengths, because it's 0th order imaging at that point. And did I actually type out? No, I abbreviated. Good. That's what I wanted. Check this just to be sure. Okay, good. So now we hit Control Save on here. It'll pop open main GUI with these new functions that it added in for us. And now what we have to do is go all the way to the bottom underneath my filler comment. And I'm going to do the same thing where I get rid of these extra comments that I don't really care for. Add in an end statement. And another end statement. Now if I hit Control plus, everything should compress down. Okay, it looks good. Alright, so again, the input function, when we actually type in that field, it's never going to do anything. So this one is the least important to us. And then the creation function is also pretty irrelevant. So the only one we're actually going to add code to is the callback when you press the button we actually put. Let's go ahead and put some comments on this. White light filter controls. Oh, and since we are all done working in device initialization GUI, let's just go ahead and move these to a more reasonable spot in the code. They're pretty similar to spectrometers, so I'm just going to put them right underneath the two spectrometers we have. 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, looks good. Save it. And this one are also similar to spectrometers, so I'm going to move them to be pretty close to where our spectrometer buttons are. In here somewhere. Oh, I think I passed it. Here it is, spectrometer. All right. Now, the first thing we're going to do is make it so that those are disabled on startup, because until you initialize a device, you can't use any of its functions. So I'm going to go up to my my opening function. And similar to all of these parts here, for example, down here, where I turn my spectrometer buttons on or off initially, I'm going to do the same thing here. Let me just copy the code I've already written. And you can see that turns off the white light filter button and the white light filter input. Okay. Let's see how I like that. Okay, so we forgot to put in a disable statement somewhere along the line. Let's just set the enable on that to be off. Oh, I see where I screwed up. I inserted that code a line too early. There. And let me just copy this and add it into the other code we're going to use coming up shortly. Alright, so now if I go ahead and run that, it doesn't turn it on yet. So now we've got to make it so that when you initialize a device, if you initialize the white light filter, it turns these buttons on. So we go into the initialize devices call inside main GUI, which is here, right at the top. And somewhere in here, we're just going to add in this type of an if statement. If it's on, turn on the buttons. Now, I'll put it next to the spectrometer if I can. Okay, here's the spectrometer. And I'll just copy and paste this code that I already wrote. There. So, if the white light filter state is on, turn on the filter button, set the current input field to whatever the current wavelength setting is, and set the input field to be enabled. Let's go ahead and check. Okay, it turned it on. Now, of course, if I type in some random number here, nothing's actually going to happen because we haven't programmed that in yet. Let me just check my notes. Okay, our next step is to code in the callback functions for those buttons so that something will actually happen. So we go down to where I put them here. And this is the code that'll execute if somebody presses that button. And we're actually going to update this a little bit. So currently it's set up to just be a button, but I also want it to be possible to call this function externally. So I'm going to add in a var argin here. And then we're going to do an if statement on that. So if it's called externally, then the input is the desired wavelength. That's going to be used for our step and glue algorithm, things like that. If it's just a button press, var argin will have 0 elements, and so this piece of code will run, and it'll read the string from the input field, and it'll convert it to a number, and we'll have our desired wavelength, whatever the user is requesting. So next, let me just go ahead and copy the rest of this whole block of code here. Okay. So now, all right, make it clear that MATLAB's working. That's just putting the string up top and setting it to say working. Gray out the buttons while the spectrometer is tuning. Now, if it's an oriel spectrometer that we're using, currently it's the only one, go ahead and set the wavelength using our basic library. update the GUI to display the current value. And then inside of the data structure, we actually want to record two things. We want to record what the actual wavelength is and what we tried to put it to. Because normally if you tell it, hey, go to 650 nanometers, it's actually going to go to something more like 649.98 or something like that. And so if you want to reproduce, for example, when you're taking reflectivity, the exact settings you use to take another set of images, you need to record what you were trying to hit and also what you actually hit. Then once you record those two things, you ungray out the button, say we're done working, and update the handle structure. Okay, looks good. Let's test it out. All right. Let's see what happens if I tell it to go to 650 pass-through. Okay, some sort of error. Let's see. It says... because that should be handles.devices.whitelightFilterName. All right, let's try that again here. All right, I was able to hear the spectrometer turn because it's sitting just a few feet away from me. And it looks like we made another mistake here. Oh. Okay, and this should be called current wavelength. There. All right. All right, looks good. Now, if I save this, and I go look at my data structure, I don't have anything about the white light. So now we are going to code in the saving data behavior. Oh, wait a minute. It didn't have anything in there? Oh, it did have something. Okay. But that's actually not enough on its own. We actually want to have it so every time you hit collect data, just in case something changed, it updates that field. So let's go ahead and find the collect data function. So every algorithm in main GUI is ran through the snap image wrapper, basically. Really, it's actually they call snap image callback, which then calls snap image wrapper. And what we need to do is put in some code so that it'll check and update these stored values in the data structure. So let's find where the spectrometer is and put it somewhere close by to that, if we could. Here's the spectrometer. So let's go ahead and I'll copy this code that I already wrote. Measure and record all white light filter data. So if the filter's on, get the current wavelength and update what's displayed. And if it's not, remove the corresponding fields from our data structure. Now, something you might realize here is we're removing the white light filter wavelength target, which is what we tried to hit, the 650 we typed, and we're removing the actual wavelength value, maybe 649.9 or whatever it is. But we don't record both of them. And the reason is because there isn't a way to do it. When you request a wavelength, that's the only time that piece of information is around. So you have to record it then and there, which is why we recorded it inside of the previous button. Let me show you that. Somewhere in here. See here, I recorded in my data structure both the current wavelength and the wavelength target. And I have to do that right here because this is when you change the wavelength. So you have to record the target wavelength here. Okay. So now that should just about do it. Let's run it and see if it works. Okay. And let's say I set it to 700. And now if I save this, don't ever actually save things inside the working software folder, but I'm the one who wrote all this, so I'm allowed to. But I'm going to delete this right after. Okay, and it's got the corresponding numbers saved. Alright, so that's the basics of how to add a device to main GUI. Next up, I'm going to be creating a more complicated button, which is going to be something to lock the white light filter with the step and glue algorithm so that we're able to collect reflectivity in a narrow band to avoid absorption effects. But I'm not going to record that. This video was just to show the basic idea of how to add a generic button. So good luck, and if you ever need help, you can always email me.